Hey guys, it's Krista Watson here from Krista Quilts, and today kicks off the first in my series of 99 machine quilting designs for my book of the same name. We're going to start off with super easy designs called wavy lines and overlapping wavy lines. These are two designs that you can do easily with your walking foot, and they're some of my go-to favorites. To start off, I'm going to draw out every design just on my iPad. You can use a piece of paper, and then I'm going to stitch out the design on a practice sample. Today, I will be quilting design number 13, single wavy lines, and design number 14, overlapping wavy lines. My machine is set to straight stitching. So this is what it looks like when I'm gonna draw out the quilting plan for those simple wavy lines. So first I'm going to use the seam lines as a guide on my quilt. If my quilt blocks are like 6 inches apart, then this first set of wavy lines is going to be stitched in the ditch between each of the major seam lines. If my blocks are 12 inches, then they're going to be 12 inches apart, and so on and so forth. So this first set of wavy lines is basically what I call anchor stitching. Then I'm going to go back and I'm going to draw additional wavy lines in between the previous lines to basically tighten up the design and add more stitching and texture. Now I can do 1, 2, or more passes across the quilt depending on how densely I want the lines to be and how much texture I'm adding to the quilt. It's really up to me how much quilting I want to do. And the most important thing is my drawing is not exactly matching up to my stitching. It's just an estimation of what I'm going to do. So to quilt my wavy lines across my practice sample, I'm going to start on the right hand side and work my way towards the center, stitching lines roughly evenly apart. Now you'll notice that I'm using a contrasting thread. The reason I'm doing that is so you can see my stitching, but if I were doing this on a real quilt, it would just be more of a blending thread and you wouldn't see the stitches as much. The other thing that I'm doing is I'm using my even feed foot, which is built into my machine. It's called a dual feed foot. This works the same way as a walking foot. My feed dogs are engaged and I'm stitching. Now in order to form those wavy lines, all I'm doing is I'm wiggling my sample back and forth. Once I quilt one pass of wavy lines across the quilt, then I can decide how much, how close, or how dense I want my lines to be. I can quilt a second pass, a third pass, and so on, depending on how dense I want my lines to be. Sometimes what I'll do is I will just quilt 1 or 2 passes, take the quilt off, look at it, see if I like it, and then decide at that point whether or not I want to keep on going. A lot of times I really do like to quilt my quilts densely, so I am going to stitch additional passes in between the previous lines of stitching. The more quilting you add, the denser it's going to be, the more textural it's going to be. And a little bonus tip I want to share with you is if you're using a natural fiber such as cotton fabric, cotton thread, cotton batting, you can quilt really densely and it's not going to make your quilt stiff. So just enjoy quilting, add as many lines as you want, and just remember they're organic, they're irregular, and they don't have to look like anybody else's design. And this is what my practice piece looks like after quilting 3 passes of wavy lines. So let's say that I do want my wavy lines to be a little more evenly spaced. So in that case, I'm gonna go ahead and mark the lines. I can use painter's tape, or I can use a washable pen, and I can measure out the lines. I can use seam lines as my guide to tell me where I want the lines to go. It's really up to me how I want to do it. You'll also notice that when I marked my straight lines, I am stitching on top of them, but I'm still quilting a wavy line. In other words, I'm not going to try to draw out the wiggles. Those are still going to be like irregular and however they're going to end up. I'm not trying to line those up at all. So I'm still going to stitch 1 pass of wavy lines across the quilt to anchor or secure the quilt, and then I'm going to stitch additional passes. Again, it depends on the design I'm going for, whether or not I'm going to draw out every single line or some of the lines. Once you're happy with the density of your stitching, go ahead and remove your marked lines. Now let's talk about the next design, overlapping wavy lines. If you want even more density, you can quilt more passes on top of your previously stitched wavy lines. Here's what my quilting plan looks like. Black lines 1 through 4 represent my first pass of anchor stitching. The red lines represent the second pass of quilting, and then I'll fill in with additional wavy lines, touching and crossing some of the previously stitched lines. So when I'm quilting these overlapping wavy lines, I'm basically adding a lot of texture to my quilt. This could be the 4th, 5th, 6th pass across the quilt. It's gonna take a little bit longer, but the results are definitely worth it. So the idea with these overlapping wavy lines is they're gonna be very organic. You'll notice I'm not marking anything, the bumps are not lining up in any particular order, and as I stitch the lines, I'm basically weaving in and out of the previous stitch lines. This is an especially good design, number one, if you want to add texture to your quilt, and number two, if you have a lot of seam lines that don't quite match up, maybe your points aren't perfectly straight, adding this layer of texture on top of it can really hide those imperfections. And that's what overlapping wavy lines looks like stitched out on my finished practice sample. Just remember, you get to decide whether to use blending thread or contrasting thread to either show or hide your stitching. And that's how you quilt wavy lines and overlapping wavy lines. Now on the quilt behind me, this is one of my standalone patterns called Churn Dash Slide. I have quilted the wavy lines with one slight variation. I've done them on the diagonal to mimic the design of the pieced quilt blocks to kind of emphasize that diagonal structure of the quilt. I've done this several times on lots of quilts. In fact, I have 2 free patterns where I've used the wavy lines going in an up and down position, so be sure to check those out. One of them is called Puzzle Box and the other one is called Streamers, both using fabrics I have designed. So whether you want to quilt the wavy lines in one direction or a diagonal direction, you're really going to enjoy it. Be sure to check out my description box for links to all of my patterns, freebies, tutorials, and the book that you can follow along. Until next time, happy quilting!